Maxim Gelman. On the morning of February 11th, 2011, New York City woke up to a crime scene that refused to stop moving. By the time it ended, 4 people were dead, 5 more were wounded, and a man was sitting in a subway car while passengers around him recognized his face from that morning's newspaper. It had taken 28 hours to get there. And the reason it started at all was an argument about a car. Maxim Gelman was born on May 31, 1987, in Ukraine, and came to the United States as a child, eventually becoming a citizen in 2005. He grew up in the Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn, attended Abraham Lincoln High School, and moved through the neighborhood as a skateboarder, largely unremarkable to everyone around him. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he had accumulated roughly 10 arrests, most of them for graffiti and vandalism. Nothing in that record anticipated what happened on February 11th. The morning it began, Gelman argued with his mother in the apartment they shared with his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, 54 years old. The dispute was over Gelman using Kuznetsov's car without permission. What followed was not an impulse. Gelman stabbed his stepfather to death in their home. Then he drove. His next destination was the apartment of Yelena Bulchenko, a 20-year-old woman he had developed an obsession with. Her mother, Anna Bulchenko, 56, was home when he arrived. Gelman took her life as well. Then, rather than leave, he sat in the apartment and waited for Yelena to return. When she arrived home, he attacked her, stabbing her 11 times. She survived. He fled. What came next across the remaining hours was less a series of crimes than a declaration that the city belonged to him. He rear-ended a car on the street and stabbed the driver when the man stepped out to confront him. He struck 62-year-old Stephen Tannenbaum in a pedestrian crossing, inflicting injuries that would claim his life. He carjacked a livery driver and slashed his throat so severely the man lost his voice permanently. He attacked another motorist. He did not stop. Early on February 12th, he boarded a Manhattan 3 train heading uptown. At the time, transit police officers assigned to the train were sheltering inside the motorman's cab, aware that Gelman was being tracked. A passenger named Joseph Lozito, a father of 2 who had recognized Gelman from a photograph in that morning's newspaper, stood up and confronted him in the car. Gelman attacked him. The 2 men struggled across the floor of the subway car while the motorman's cab door remained closed. Lozito sustained significant injuries but managed to pin Gelman down. The officers emerged after the fight was over and took Gelman into custody. What explanation could account for any of it? When investigators asked Gelman why his 4 victims had to die, he gave them 4 words: "Because I said so." The legal process was, under the circumstances, brief. Gelman pleaded guilty to all charges on November 30, 2011. On January 18, 2012, Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Vincent Del Giudice sentenced him to 200 years to life, describing him from the bench as a violent predator and sociopath. The sentencing was not quiet. Gelman laughed throughout the proceeding. He shouted at the victims' families across the courtroom. Yelena Bulchenko's boyfriend told him, directly and without hesitation, that he could burn in hell. A separate Manhattan proceeding followed in February 2012, addressing the stabbing of Joseph Lozito on the subway. Justice Richard Carruthers added 25 years to the total. Gelman used his allocution to propose marriage to a television celebrity and directed obscenities at the man he had left bleeding on the floor of a train. Carruthers told those in the courtroom that they had been subjected that day to something of Gelman's evil, unrepentant nature. And somehow, it gets worse. During intake, Gelman had failed the psychiatric evaluation at Rikers Island, and was briefly transferred to Bellevue's psychiatric ward for assessment. In a jailhouse interview, he stated he believed he was schizophrenic and bipolar, that sometimes his mind was not right. He also claimed the DEA had been targeting him before his arrest. None of those claims altered the trajectory of the legal proceedings. The 4 people whose lives he ended in a single day in February remained gone. Lozito subsequently brought a civil negligence claim against the New York City Police Department, arguing that officers had remained behind the motorman's door while he fought Gelman alone on the train. The city's legal position was that police had no actionable duty to protect any individual member of the public. The case generated significant public attention and produced no resolution that satisfied the people who had survived that morning. As of this writing, Gelman remains incarcerated, serving 200 years to life plus 25 additional years in a consecutive Manhattan term. He is 38 years old. 4 people lost their lives in less than 28 hours. The next case on this list is quieter in its approach. The man at its center waited years, planned carefully, and told the court, when it was all over, that God had instructed him to do it. Mark David Chapman. Earlier on the afternoon of December 8, 1980, John Lennon had walked out of the Dakota apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, paused on the sidewalk, and signed an autograph for a man standing near the entrance. They exchanged a few words. Lennon left for a recording session. That evening, Lennon returned from the studio, stepped out of his car, and the same man fired 5 shots at him from a .38 special revolver. 4 bullets struck him in the back. The man then sat down on the sidewalk and opened a paperback novel. He was reading it when police arrived. John Lennon was 40 years old. He had spent much of the previous 5 years in relative quiet, raising his son Sean and stepping back from recording. He and Yoko Ono had just released Double Fantasy, their first collaboration in years, and Lennon had spoken in an interview earlier that day about his contentment with life as it was. Earlier that same afternoon, he had signed a copy of that album for the man waiting outside his building. Mark David Chapman was born on May 10, 1955, in Fort Worth, Texas, and raised in Decatur, Georgia. He had been, by his own account, a devoted Beatles fan in his younger years. That admiration had curdled over time into something more brittle, a fixation on the protagonist of Salinger's novel, and a conviction that Lennon was a hypocrite who preached equality while accumulating enormous wealth and celebrity. Chapman had traveled to New York from Hawaii with a specific purpose. He had formed his intent months before, and had in fact made an earlier trip to the city, turned back without acting, and returned to complete what he had started. Because authorities feared that Lennon's supporters might attempt to reach Chapman at any facility holding him, and because his first court-appointed attorney withdrew. After receiving credible threats to his own safety, Chapman was transferred to Rikers Island. He did not settle quietly into the routine there. Guards reported that he destroyed his television, removed his clothing, flooded his cell's toilet, and threw water at staff. It reportedly took 6 officers to subdue him during one episode. A rotating group of psychiatrists examined him in the months that followed. In February 1981, he sent a handwritten statement to the New York Times urging readers to obtain The Catcher in the Rye. His attorney, Jonathan Marks, advised him to mount an insanity defense. Chapman refused. In June 1981, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, telling the court the decision had come from God. He received a sentence of 20 years to life. So how does a man who took one of the most recognized cultural figures of the 20th century justify that act, to himself and to a parole board, 45 years on? He has appeared before the board 14 times. The language in his hearings has grown more deliberate and more elaborate with each appearance. In a 2020 hearing, he described what he did as an assassination, done for no reason other than Lenin's fame, driven by what he called a desire for self-glory. He told the board he had been very, very, very much seeking self-glory. The word appeared 4 times in that one sentence. He described it as the most selfish act he had ever encountered. Yoko Ono has submitted written opposition to his release at every hearing since the process began. She has maintained consistently that his freedom would be incompatible with public safety and expressed concern that Chapman himself could be harmed by members of the public if released. Corrections officials have stated on record that he took Lenin's life for no reason other than to gain notoriety. The New York State Board of Parole has agreed 14 times in a row without exception. His most recent denial came on August 27, 2025, following his 14th appearance before the board at Green Haven. His next scheduled hearing is set for February 2027. He will be 71 years old when he sits before them again. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The obsession had been building for years. A plan had been formed, abandoned on one trip, and then completed on the next. The signs existed in plain sight, and none of them triggered any intervention until the moment outside the Dakota, when it was already too late. Chapman is currently held at Green Haven Correctional Facility. He is 70 years old. He has been incarcerated for 45 years, and the board has not wavered. The next case shares something with this one. A young man who occupied a certain social world, or at least projected the image of one, who committed an act of violence and then built an explanation for it that placed the weight of responsibility on the person who did not live to respond. Where Chapman claimed divine instruction, the next man claimed something far more difficult to disprove in a courtroom. Robert Chambers. On the morning of August 26, 1986, a jogger moving through Central Park near the back of the Metropolitan Museum of Art came upon the body of a young woman lying in the grass. She was partially unclothed and had visible trauma around her neck. She was 18 years old. Her name was Jennifer Levin, and she had been seen leaving a bar on the Upper East Side called Dorian's Red Hand after 4 in the morning, in the company of a young man named Robert Chambers. When police located Chambers that day, he had fresh, deep scratches running down his face. His explanation was that Jennifer Levin had put them there herself. He told investigators her death had been an accident, the result of rough sex in Central Park during which she had been the aggressor, and that he had been trying to free himself from her grip when she died. He said he had not meant to harm her. Robert Chambers was born on September 25, 1966. He had attended a succession of elite Manhattan preparatory schools on the Upper East Side, carrying the appearance of privilege that those schools conferred, even as his family's actual financial circumstances were considerably more modest. He was tall, 19 years old, and physically striking, and the tabloids named the case almost immediately the Preppy Killer, that framing shaped public perception of what was at stake before the legal process had properly begun. Released from Rikers Island during the early period of the case on $150,000 bond, Chambers returned to his daily life while the legal machinery assembled around him. A Monsignor who visited him at Rikers described him to reporters as scared and bewildered. His defense attorney, Jack Littman, built a strategy that would place Jennifer Levin's conduct, character, and sexual history before the jury as central evidence. Littman would argue that Levin had been the initiator of what occurred in the park that night. The trial, which began in December 1987, drew enormous press coverage. The courtroom became a daily production. Cameras tracked every arrival. The tabloids printed every development. Jennifer Levin's family sat through every session and watched her life become an exhibit in her own death investigation. The prosecution, led by Linda Fairstein, met that strategy directly and with force. In her arguments, Fairstein noted that in more than 8,000 assault cases she had handled over 10 years, the Chambers case was the first in which a male defendant had claimed to have been sexually assaulted by a female. The defense maintained its approach. The trial became, in the eyes of many who followed it, less a proceeding about what Robert Chambers had done than an extended argument about who Jennifer Levin was. 13 weeks of testimony. How does a case with a named suspect, fresh scratches on his face, and a victim found in the park yards from where they were last seen together end without a verdict? 9 days of deliberations produced none. The jury was deadlocked. On March 25, 1988, as deliberations were still ongoing, Chambers agreed to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter, acknowledging on the record that he had intended to cause Jennifer Levin physical harm. He received a sentence of 5 to 15 years, and on that same morning, a videotape surfaced. It had been recorded at a private gathering months before the plea. In it, Chambers twisted the head off a small doll and said with visible amusement, "Oops, I think I killed her." That's not a typo, by the way. The same morning, he stood in court and admitted to harming Jennifer Levin. Footage was circulating of him making a joke about it at a party. Chambers served the full 15-year maximum of his sentence. He accumulated additional time in disciplinary segregation during his incarceration, following violations that included drug possession and assaulting a correctional officer. He was released on Valentine's Day, 2003. He was 36 years old. He remained free for 4 years. In October 2007, he was arrested for selling cocaine from his Manhattan apartment. He pleaded guilty in 2008 and received a sentence of 19 years. Jennifer Levin's mother, Ellen, had spent the years between those two sentences building a victims' rights advocacy career that produced more than a dozen pieces of legislation. Her public statement when the second sentence was handed down was precise. Chambers had received more prison time for selling drugs than for taking her daughter's life. Chambers was released on July 25, 2023, and remains on parole through 2028. A civil wrongful death judgment against him requires that a share of any future income, up to $25 million, be directed to the Levin family. He is 60 years old. Ellen Levin is still working. That accounting has not ended. The next case began in public, during riots that had been building for years before one night brought everything to the surface. A 29-year-old man was walking alone through a neighborhood already on fire when the night found him. Lemrick Nelson Jr. On the evening of August 19, 1991, a car traveling in a motorcade escorting the Grand Rebbe of the Lubavitch movement through the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn ran a red light at the intersection of President Street and Utica Avenue and struck two young cousins who were crossing the street. 7-year-old Gavin Cato was killed. His cousin was injured. When a private ambulance operated by a Jewish organization arrived at the scene, an officer directed the crew to first attend to the driver of the car that had caused the accident. Emergency medical services for the injured children came afterward. By nightfall, Crown Heights was in flames. The riots that swept through the neighborhood over the next 3 nights were not spontaneous combustion. They ran along fault lines that had been building between the Black and Hasidic Jewish communities sharing the neighborhood for years. Buildings burned, people were attacked in the streets. And on that first night, Yankel Rosenbaum died. Rosenbaum was 29 years old, an Australian doctoral student in Jewish history visiting New York to conduct research at archives. He had no connection to the motorcade, no involvement in the events that had begun the riots. He was walking alone in Crown Heights when a mob surrounded him. A man named Charles Price had been moving through the crowd that evening, calling on people to find a Jew. What the crowd did to Yankel Rosenbaum was stab him 4 times and leave him in the street. Police arrested 16-year-old Lemrick Nelson Jr. near the scene with a blood-stained knife in his pocket. Officers brought him to the hospital bedside of the man who had been stabbed. Yankel Rosenbaum, lying on a stretcher and barely conscious, identified Nelson as the person who had attacked him. He looked at the boy standing over him and asked, "Why did you stab me?" Rosenbaum died at Kings County Hospital later that night. A subsequent review established that one of the 4 stab wounds had gone undetected by the treating medical team for approximately an hour. A dying man identified his attacker from a hospital bed. Police found the weapon, still stained, on the suspect. The case went to a state jury. On October 29, 1992, that jury acquitted Nelson of all charges related to Rosenbaum's death. The verdict produced immediate and lasting outrage. People gathered outside the courthouse. The reaction ran through the city and reached well beyond it. Historian Edward Shapiro, writing later in his analysis of the Crown Heights riots, assessed the political fallout directly, concluding it was possible Mayor David Dinkins would have won re-election in 1993 had the jury returned a different verdict. That a dying man's identification, combined with a blood-stained knife found on the suspect at the scene, had produced an acquittal was a fact the city did not absorb easily. The acquittal became embedded in the larger accounting of how the city's institutions had handled, or failed to handle, the events of August 1991 and the aftermath that followed them. Federal prosecutors took the case in 1997, charging Nelson with violating Yankel Rosenbaum's civil rights under federal statute. Judge David Traeger sentenced him to 19.5 years. That verdict was subsequently vacated on appeal when the reviewing court found that the trial judge had improperly shaped the jury's composition along racial and religious lines, a procedural error significant enough to require a new trial. At the 2003 federal retrial, Nelson admitted for the first time that he had in fact stabbed Rosenbaum. His explanation was that he had been drunk and had gotten caught up in the energy of the crowd that night. A former detective testified that throughout his arrest and processing, Nelson had referred to Rosenbaum exclusively and repeatedly as the Jew. The jury convicted him of the civil rights violation, but found that his actions had not caused Rosenbaum's death, a logical conclusion that legal scholar Sherry Kolb described in her 2003 analysis as one that could most generously be called misguided, and less generously as simply not coherent. Nelson received the maximum available under the federal civil rights conviction, 10 years. He was released around 2004 after serving approximately that term. Yankel Rosenbaum's brother Norman rejected every framing of the stabbing as the product of crowd energy or confusion. His response was direct. What Nelson described as excitement was a mob moving through the streets calling out, "There's a Jew, let's get the Jew." Their mother, Faye, described her son as the consummate innocent victim, taken by blind, baseless bigotry because he happened to be Jewish and walking in that neighborhood on that particular night. As of this date, Lemrick Nelson Jr. has served his sentence and is no longer incarcerated. The Rosenbaum family has never received what they consider a complete accounting for what was taken from them. The next case begins with a different kind of failure. Not a riot, not a verdict that defied the evidence, but years of a man going to hospitals, asking for help, being turned away, going again, being turned away again, until one afternoon on a subway platform in Manhattan, he caused a harm that the system had the opportunity to prevent a dozen times over, and did not. If you are liking this video and you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Andrew Goldstein. Kendra Webdale was 32 years old, a writer who had moved to New York from a small town in western New York State and was building a life in the city. She had a job, an apartment, a circle of friends, and the kind of ordinary morning routine that never registers as remarkable until it becomes the last one. On January 3rd, 1999, she was standing on the platform at the 23rd Street station waiting for the N train. She had no connection to the man standing near her, no prior encounter, no shared history. Andrew Goldstein pushed her from behind as the train arrived. She fell onto the tracks and was taken instantly. Goldstein was 29 years old at the time of the attack. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier, and his history with the mental health system in New York City was documented in enough clinical files to constitute a record of failure that stretched across a decade. In the 2 years before that January morning, he had attacked at least 13 different people. He had been hospitalized and discharged multiple times, sometimes within days of intake. He had gone to facilities asking for help and been turned away with instructions to follow up with outpatient services he had no reliable ability to navigate. He had been identified, repeatedly, as a person in crisis by the very institutions whose purpose was to hold him, and each time those institutions had sent him back out into the city. Some of his hospitalizations lasted 72 hours before discharge. Some lasted less. The system did not lack documentation of who he was. It lacked any mechanism that required it to do something sustained with that documentation. This is where the story stops being about one man and becomes an accounting of every office that handed him a discharge form and marked the case closed. The day of the attack, Goldstein was off his medication. In his statement to investigators, he described what happened using the word fit, saying he had shoved without awareness of direction or intent, and came back to himself with Kendra Webdale already on the tracks. He did not frame it as a denial. He could not explain it, only that he had done it. His first trial, in November 1999, ended in a hung jury, splitting 10-2 in favor of conviction. A second trial began in March 2000. That jury returned a verdict of second-degree murder. Justice Carol Berkman sentenced Goldstein to 25 years to life. 5 years later, the New York Court of Appeals reversed that conviction. The ground was a Sixth Amendment violation. A prosecution psychiatrist had presented testimony by recounting statements made by other clinicians who had evaluated Goldstein but never appeared in court to be cross-examined. The decision in People v. Goldstein sent the case back for a third proceeding before a court had been able to fully resolve it even once. How does a legal process require 3 separate attempts to resolve a case where the defendant never denied the act itself? Facing that third trial in 2006, Goldstein entered a guilty plea to manslaughter, acknowledging on the record that he had understood, at the moment he pushed Kendra Webdale, that what he was doing was wrong. The sentence was 23 years, plus 5 years of mandatory court-supervised psychiatric treatment to follow his release. He was transferred to a treatment facility in September 2018 after serving approximately 19 years. The legal outcome was only part of what Kendra Webdale's death produced. In the months that followed, New York state legislators began drafting what would become Kendra's Law. The process involved mental health advocates, psychiatric professionals, civil liberties organizations with concerns about coercive treatment, and people like Patricia Webdale, who was navigating a grief no parent should have to carry and doing it in public because she believed something had to change. Kendra's Law was signed by Governor George Pataki on August 27, 1999, 8 months after Kendra Webdale's death. The law created a court order mechanism for assisted outpatient psychiatric treatment, requiring the system to maintain oversight of high-risk individuals, rather than cycling them through hospitalizations without sustained follow-through. Patricia Webdale, Kendra's mother, became one of the law's most prominent public advocates. She told state legislators that many of the people the system was failing were suffering from the same conditions as the man who had taken her daughter, and that the question facing New York was what it intended to do to reach them before something irreversible happened again. By 2016, more than 14,600 individuals had been placed in court-ordered outpatient treatment under that statute. The law has been extended and expanded multiple times since its original passage. Each reauthorization has been accompanied by studies showing that individuals placed under assisted outpatient treatment had significantly reduced rates of rehospitalization, arrest, and incarceration compared to their prior histories. The research consistently found that the sustained oversight the law required was producing the outcomes that voluntary systems had repeatedly failed to produce for the same population of individuals. As of this writing, Andrew Goldstein has completed both his prison sentence and his supervised treatment period. He is in his mid-50s. The law named for the woman whose death set all of this in motion remains in effect in New York State. It did not restore what was lost on that platform in January of 1999, but it changed what the city does for the people who come after her. Systems fail in quiet, bureaucratic ways. What comes next is a man who spent decades making sure the system bent to him through corruption, intimidation, and the willingness to authorize violence, until one former ally decided the arrangement was no longer worth protecting. John Gotti. For most of the 1980s, John Gotti walked into federal courtrooms and walked back out again. 3 separate prosecutions. 3 acquittals. Jurors were approached before they could deliberate. Witnesses disappeared or changed their accounts before they could be heard in full. The FBI spent years constructing cases that collapsed before a verdict could be reached, and New York's newspapers eventually settled on a nickname that described the situation exactly: the Teflon Don. Nothing that law enforcement brought to him would stick. Then Salvatore Gravano heard himself described in his own boss's recorded voice, and everything changed. John Joseph Gotti was born on October 27, 1940, the 5th of 13 children, in a family that moved through the South Bronx and eventually East New York, Brooklyn. He began accumulating arrests as a teenager and advanced through the Gambino crime family steadily through the 1960s and 70s, building a reputation for operational discipline and for violence that was applied whenever the situation called for it. By the mid-1980s, he was a capo positioned close to the top of one of the most influential organized crime organizations in the country, and he had identified what he believed was the correct path to running it himself. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was shot and taken from his life outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan during the evening hours, in front of multiple witnesses on a busy midtown block. Gotti had authorized and organized the assassination. Within days, he was the acting boss of the Gambino family. He had arranged the killing of a sitting boss on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk during the holiday season, and for years, the federal government could not prove it. How do you build a prosecution against a man who understands exactly which parts of the system can be purchased? The 3 prosecutions of the late 1980s each came apart through jury tampering and witness intimidation. A juror in the 1987 trial, George Pape, was later convicted of accepting a bribe to deliver an acquittal. Gotti understood the leverage points in the process and had invested heavily in compromising them before the trials began. In December 1990, the FBI and the New York City Police Department arrested Gotti, his underboss Salvatore Gravano, and senior figure Frank Locascio under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Statute, a federal law built specifically to dismantle organizational criminal infrastructure rather than pursue individual acts in sequence. They were held without bail pending trial. While in custody, Gravano was permitted to review recordings of wiretapped conversations in which Gotti spoke about him to other associates, questioning his loyalty, attributing problems to him that Gravano considered fabricated, and diminishing his standing within the organization. Gravano made a calculation. The decision Gravano was processing was not a small one. The code of silence, the understanding that cooperation with federal law enforcement was the single most unforgivable act a member of the organization could commit, was the foundation on which every protection the mafia offered had been built. Families had maintained it for generations. Breaking it carried consequences that did not end with the person who broke it. Gravano had a wife, children, and a life entirely constructed inside an organization that did not forgive this. On November 13, 1991, he made the choice anyway. Gravano formally agreed to cooperate with the government. He admitted to participation in 19 homicides, 10 of which he attributed to Gotti's authorization. He became the highest-ranking member of the New York Mafia ever to turn government witness, and his decision dismantled the structure of silence that the organization had maintained for decades as its primary defense against federal prosecution. And no, I am not making that up. The man Gotti had trusted at the top of his organization walked into a courtroom and gave prosecutors the case they had spent years failing to build on their own. The trial before Judge Oilio Glasser proceeded with an anonymous, sequestered jury, an acknowledgement of what had happened to previous panels. On April 2, 1992, after approximately 14 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Gotti on all 13 counts, including the murder of Paul Castellano, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. FBI Assistant Director James Fox stood outside the courthouse and told reporters that the Teflon was gone and the Velcro was here, and that every charge had stuck. Gotti's supporters overturned cars outside the Brooklyn courthouse. On June 23, 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He served most of his remaining years in near-total isolation at the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998, and died on June 10, 2002, at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. In the months and years after the conviction, the effects on the Gambino family and on New York's broader organized crime landscape were significant and lasting. Leadership passed through several hands in rapid succession as federal pressure continued. The willingness of cooperating witnesses to testify, demonstrated in the Gotti case, produced a wave of additional prosecutions throughout the 1990s against all 5 families. The structure that had allowed organized crime to operate as a semi-institutionalized parallel economy in New York for decades did not collapse overnight, but it lost the confidence in its own impunity that had been its most essential resource. The prosecution endures in memory not only for what it did to Gotti, but for what it demonstrated. A federal RICO prosecution, combined with a cooperating witness who had operated at the organization's highest level, succeeded where traditional law enforcement had failed for decades. The Gambino family never recovered the position it held before April of 1992. The case that follows also began with a federal prosecution and ended somewhere New York had not been in more than 50 years, with a jury in a federal courthouse voting to impose a sentence of death. Ronell Wilson. On the night of March 10, 2003, 2 undercover detectives were sitting in the back of a car on Staten Island in the middle of a gun purchase operation. Their names were James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews. Nemerin was 36 years old, a father of 2 children who had spent years doing the kind of work that required wearing someone else's identity into situations that could end badly. Andrews was 34, his partner for this operation. Both were members of the Staten Island robbery squad, experienced in undercover work, and both understood what they were walking into that night. What they did not know was that the man they were about to meet had already decided how this was going to end. Ronell Wilson got into that car, and within minutes both men had been shot in the backs of their heads at point-blank range. Wilson searched their bodies, took their car, and drove away. New York State's death penalty had already been struck down by the courts. The federal government decided that was not where the matter would end. Ronell Earl Wilson was born on May 4, 1982, and grew up in the Stapleton Houses public housing complex on Staten Island. He was affiliated with a local gang and known in his neighborhood by the name Rated R. What he did not know when he climbed into that car on March 10th was that the men waiting inside were New York City Police Department detectives running a sting, or that what he was about to do would produce a federal prosecution that would run through the courts for 13 years, through 2 death sentences, 2 reversals, and a final constitutional determination that ended it. What the prosecution established at trial was not complicated. Wilson had taken money from the detectives under the pretense of a gun transaction, and then decided, before that transaction could complete, that the 2 men in that car were better eliminated than left as witnesses. He shot them both from behind, at close range, in the back of the head. The detail that the prosecution spent the penalty phase returning to repeatedly was the one Wilson himself had provided in the lyrics found on his person. He had described almost exactly what he had done, and he had written it down. Federal jurisdiction meant that New York State's absence of a death penalty was not the end of the conversation. The United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York charged Wilson under federal statutes that carried the possibility of execution, specifically the killing of federal officers in connection with a drug trafficking crime, a charge that did not require the state death penalty to be in place. It was a decision that transformed what might have been a state murder prosecution into the most consequential federal capital case in New York in half a century. The trial proceeded before Judge Nicholas Garofis in the Eastern District of New York. The case went to the jury on December 20, 2006, and came back guilty on all counts. The penalty phase convened in January 2007. Prosecutors called the widows of both detectives. Rose Nemarin testified about her husband and their children. The jury also heard from Andrews's widow, Denise, about what had been taken from their family on that night in March. The testimony was not technical or evidentiary. It was the kind of accounting that a penalty phase requires, a demonstration, in personal terms, of what the crime had actually cost. They also introduced a handwritten document found on Wilson at arrest, a set of lyrics he had written describing putting rounds into the back of someone's head and stating that he would not stop until he was dead himself. Judge Garofis ruled the document admissible, finding that it described activity resembling the murders and appeared to have been composed after they occurred. What makes a jury in a city that had not handed down a federal death sentence since 1954 make that decision? On January 30, 2007, that jury did exactly that. Wilson became the first person in New York to receive a federal death sentence in more than half a century. When the verdict was read, he turned in the direction of Detective Nemarin's widow and extended his tongue toward her. Rose Nemarin spoke outside the courthouse afterward. She said justice had been served and that her husband could finally rest. The Second Circuit vacated the sentence in 2010. The ground for reversal was that prosecutors had improperly argued Wilson's exercise of his right to trial, rather than pleading guilty, was evidence of a lack of remorse. The case returned to the district court. During the period Wilson spent at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, while awaiting resentencing proceedings, a federal corrections officer named Nancy Gonzalez became pregnant with his child. She was convicted of misconduct and sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison. A second jury reimposed the death sentence on July 24, 2013. That sentence also ended in the district court. In March 2016, Judge Garofis ruled that Wilson was intellectually disabled under the Supreme Court standard, and that executing him was therefore constitutionally prohibited. He resentenced Wilson to life without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors declined to appeal. Michael Palladino, president of the Detectives Endowment Association, responded to the ruling by stating publicly that a considerable amount of calculated thought had gone into Wilson's actions on the night he took James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews from their families, and that the finding did not account for what had actually happened in that car. As of this writing, Ronald Wilson is held at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He is 43 years old and serving life without parole. The names of the two detectives remain with the people who worked alongside them. What comes last on this list is the strangest case of the 8. A man who consulted astrology charts to identify strangers to shoot, built his entire criminal identity around a killer who was never caught, and was eventually caught because he could not stop. Heriberto Seda. Between 1990 and 1993, a series of shootings spread across New York City's boroughs without obvious pattern. The victims did not know each other. The locations were not connected. The only thread was what arrived afterward. Letters addressed to police precincts and newspapers, written in coded language using maritime signal flag ciphers, closing each time with the same mark, a crosshair symbol above 3 sevens. The shooter had chosen his model. He was going to be the New York Zodiac Killer. And for 3 years, no one knew who he was. Heriberto Seda was born on July 31, 1967, and grew up in the East New York section of Brooklyn. He was a high school dropout who had developed 3 interlocking obsessions: astrology, the firearms he built himself from spare components, and the original Zodiac Killer, the California murderer who had taunted law enforcement with coded communications in the late 1960s and was never identified. That last part was the point. What Seda found compelling about the California case was its ending. The Zodiac was never caught. He wanted that for himself. He built a list of targets based on their zodiac signs. He was not selecting people. He was working through symbols. His first confirmed attack was in 1990. Over the following 3 years, he shot 8 people and took the lives of 3: Joseph Prose, Patricia Fonte, and Joseph Diaconi. His coded letters arrived during the investigation and were initially difficult to decode. New York Post reporter Kieran Crowley worked through the cipher system and helped investigators interpret the messages. A 1994 arrest for a homemade zip gun came close to breaking the case open, but the weapon was mislabeled in the evidence system, and his fingerprints were purged before anyone connected the file to the Zodiac investigation. He was released. The shootings stopped. The case went cold. For nearly 2 years, nothing moved. Then, in June 1996, Seda got into an argument with his half-sister, Gladys Reyes, over her boyfriend. He shot her in the back. He then held her friend hostage inside the building. 17 officers responded to the scene. The standoff lasted approximately 3 hours. When it ended, Seda surrendered and lowered a bucket from the rooftop. The bucket contained more than a dozen homemade zip guns. Investigators took his written confession. He signed it with the crosshair symbol above 3 sevens. A sergeant following the Zodiac investigation recognized it in the room. Fingerprints were run against the evidence from 1990 forward. The matches confirmed what the signature had already announced. Inside his apartment, officers recovered pipe bombs, additional weapons, and years of accumulated material documenting his obsession with the original California case. The evidence removed any question about what had been driving him and for how long. When asked what had led him to the shootings, Seda told a reporter from New York Magazine that he had nothing to live for, no job, no future he could see, and that the shootings were the way to become famous. That was the complete explanation. No ideology, no specific grievance against his victims, who were chosen from a Zodiac chart, not from his life. He had wanted recognition so badly that he had modeled his pursuit of it on a man whose name he did not even know. How do you build a case around a killer who had been invisible for 6 years and only surfaced because of a family argument? The trial before Queens Supreme Court Justice Robert J. Hanafy ran for 6 weeks. Prosecutors Robert Masters and Raymond Scheer presented the coded letters, the fingerprint evidence connecting Seda to the 1990 crime scenes, the signed confession, and testimony from survivors of the attacks. On June 24, 1998, Seda was convicted of 3 murders and 1 count of attempted murder for the Zodiac shootings. Justice Hanafy sentenced him to 83 1/3 years, a figure constructed to ensure no parole eligibility until well past the age of 100. A second trial in Brooklyn addressed the shooting of his half-sister, the officers involved in the standoff, and additional attempted murder counts from the Zodiac series. That proceeding added 152 1/2 years to his total. And no, I am not making that up. The combined sentences meant that Seda would serve a minimum of more than 200 years before any parole consideration was theoretically possible, a figure the courts constructed deliberately to ensure that no parole board would ever face the question. The sentencing structure was the legal system's way of saying that the arithmetic itself was the answer. Seda is currently held at Wenda Correctional Facility in New York. He is 57 years old. During his incarceration at Wenda, he married a fellow inmate. The original Zodiac killer, the man whose legacy he had tried to inherit, has never been identified. Seda was caught because he could not extend the patience he needed. He ran out of control before the city ran out of detectives. The irony he could not have anticipated was that the thing that had made the original Zodiac famous was not the violence. It was the mystery. There was no mystery here. He signed his own name to the confession. Not his actual name. The symbol he thought would outlast him. And it did, but not in the way he had intended. These 8 cases stretch across more than 4 decades of New York City history. They involve an assassination on a midtown sidewalk, riots in a Brooklyn neighborhood, a serial shooter building astrology charts, and a mob boss dismantled by the man he trusted most. None of them are finished stories. People are still serving sentences. Families are still carrying losses. Laws remain in effect that exist because of what happened on a subway platform on a January morning in 1999. Rikers Island held all of them at some point, a facility in the East River that has processed more of the city's most consequential defendants than any other single institution in its history. The city carried the weight of what they left behind long after the cells were cleared. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.